As was introduced, it's about international collaborative action, especially collaborative action. That will be an important theme. Say it goes back, say when we look back 5 or 10 years, say climate change and energy efficiency was very much considered as something from the government. They had to run it. When you talk about climate negotiations, the idea was that governments would get together in Copenhagen or wherever, come to an agreement, get home, apply regulation, and then companies and people would start to act on climate change. Say that narrative is something from the past. That's what everyone agrees now about. Say doing something about climate change and working on energy efficiency is the responsibility of every company, every city, every citizen. And there is increasing cooperation in that area. The question that we want to have on the table now is how can we increase the impact of such action, such collaborative action on energy efficiency. Before I continue with my introduction, I want to briefly introduce the panel members, and from my side, from your side, from right to left. That's first of all, there's Guy Madgwick. He is director of Eneco UK, and Eneco is a company that is very active in the area of going beyond the traditional business models and working on energy efficiency. Then we have Carsten Müller. He is the CEO of DENEFF, the German Association on Energy Efficiency, and one of the most active national business associations in this area. Next to that, it's Tom DeLay from the CEO of the Carbon Trust. He is, and the Carbon Trust is one of an organization in Britain that has been very important a very important intermediary to bring companies and other organizations to apply greater energy efficiency. And last but not least, Paul Simpson, CDP, organization playing a central role in gathering data on the performance of companies and also engaging companies on climate change. So let me, and they will further introduce themselves when they have their introductory statements. Say this action, a question that was for a long time on the table already. Okay, cities and companies, they all have their programs, they have their commitments, but what does that really mean in practice? Is say the collective, the sum of all that action, does it make a difference on a global scale? And it may be good to briefly give you the results of a study that we recently did for UNEP, and is called Climate Commitments of Subnational Actors and Businesses. So basically cities and companies. And we investigated, okay, what's the impact of all that action that is already there? And we found out that the total commitment of all these initiatives is about 3 gigatons of CO2 emission reduction in 2020 already. And that is about half of what countries have committed. So it's a very substantial contribution already. So it is not something that is just starting, it's something that is out there. We see also that energy efficiency plays a role there, but as far as we can see, the role is limited. Say, there are a lot of international initiatives, for instance, on reducing gas flaring, on reducing deforestation, or on reforestation, on agriculture, but there's only one international initiative on energy efficiency, and that's the Enlighten program. And Enlighten program is an initiative of a number of players, but 2 companies, Philips and Osram, and UNEP. UNEP is the United Nations Environmental Program is running it, and their aim is to phase out incandescent light in developing countries in the coming decade. But there are many more initiatives, of course, in all these city and company initiatives. say we talk about, for instance, cement sustainability initiative. We talk about the WWF Climate Savers initiative. There are many out there, and of course, energy efficiency implicitly or explicitly plays a strong role there. So the question that we have, okay, there is a lot out there, but can we enhance the role of energy efficiency? What is needed to strengthen and expand this role? Say, are new initiatives needed, and who should do that? Are there barriers for action, and how should we overcome these barriers? And what is the interaction between government and private sector action? Let's focus this session on companies, on the private sector. The next session will be on cities. So I'd like to give the floor now to the panelists to give their brief introductory statements. So first, Guy from Eneco.
Okay, so working out. So I've worked in the energy industry for 30 years. I actually started in oil and gas. Interesting listening to flaring gas, because one of my first jobs was out in United Arab Emirates, and I remember seeing the massive flare that we had there. We could run at midnight under the light of that, and what a waste of energy. Oil and gas, I moved to the privatized energy sector in 1990, working for a company called Powergen. I don't know how many people remember Powergen, which was eventually bought by E.ON, and I moved to RWE. And to cut a long story short, I was asked 8 years ago to do this business for Eneco. Eneco is one of the more adventurous and energy companies in Europe. It's one of the companies that actually recognizes the change that is imminent, understands that utilities must change their persona to actually prosper in a new world, very much believing in a decentralized model across the whole of Europe, and that will happen at a varying pace of change. It's very proud to be the first energy company that was accredited to the WWF Energy Savers Program, which is a real mark and is something that we are very precious about and will defend. So what's our take? What is our take? That consumers will become more active in the market, that they will become, this word, the prosumer, with far more power on controlling demand and energy, and they need companies to enable them to do this. We're very aware that there's a growing consensus among business, particularly in the SME sector, that they can control their costs and even become more self-sufficient, if not totally. So the power is inevitably moving to the customer. Energy efficiency, of course, is a function of the control of that demand. Load shifting will become endemic. It will become the standard and very much part of a production manager's job. It will become a habit, but it's all it will. The traditional utility model, as I've already said, will start to disappear. No longer will the customer get what you give him, but the customer will control what we can supply him. And that is a big shift. Working in the UK, particularly over recent months, you're very aware of government influence. The challenge that the government has in controlling costs, in controlling consumer costs, but also how it faces up to events of national importance and international importance like Paris. Do they see it as a problem rather than an opportunity? I think so at the moment, and I feel that it is about headlines but avoiding commitment, and that has to change. So hopefully within this panel we discuss what the role of government and regulation really is. The problems that I see, privatization in this country, which we went into in 1990, has pretty much given the view that an energy infrastructure comes for nothing, but there is always a cost, and there is particularly a cost for change. There is an obsession with consumer bills, and is this political or is it for the consumer? It leaves very little money if you keep hammering this particular edict for investing in the future or indeed changing the model. Energy is seen as a right rather than a precious and finite resource. I have to say, in the UK, energy efficiency measures so far have been a spectacular failure. We've seen the opening and closing of some schemes. How do we get that enthusiasm back? Is it a role of central government to put those in place? So, particularly for me, has privatization really delivered results and a more efficient business model? I think that's open to question. So, politics, politics, politics. It's still rules. What are carbon incentives? How do the lobby groups really work? We seem to be moving in this country towards a fracking model, and we heard from earlier about new nuclear. Will it ever actually happen, and at what cost? So, energy efficiency is actually here and now. It's how do we tackle it, how do we go forward with it? That's me.
Thank you very much. Clear, the customer, the consumer is very important. We already learned that earlier this morning, so it will be also in the debate now. Carsten, could you please give your introductory comments?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, I have to excuse me for my bad English, but as you already remembered, I'm from Germany. I'm chairman of the DENEFF, what is the German Association of companies working in the energy efficiency branch, and I'm also a member of the parliament, so I just dropped over from Berlin this morning, where we have plenary sessions, and we'll be back this afternoon. So first, thank you very much for your invitation. Well, what I want to mention is that, as you might know, we are working hard on the energy transition in Germany, and there are worldwide only few German words which are worldwide known. As I would say, kindergarten. Everybody knows what kindergarten means. Nearly everybody knows what Autobahn means, and I'm pretty sure that in, let's say, 2 or 3 years, nearly everybody will know what Energiewende, what energy means, and it means energy transition. So we were working hard on building a market for renewable energies, and as a second pillar of the Energiewende, we are working on the energy efficiency, and well, more or less we are discussing it under the roof of as a climate issue. And I would say we should shift a little bit and use this meeting today to shift it a little bit to the discussion of energy productivity. So, and we should use the time to show that is essential for example, growth for our industrial countries. So I just want to give you some figures at first. We are in Germany have about in the energy efficiency companies, we have about 800,000 people working. We have we are talking about 160 billion euros of return, and we are discussing a growth per annual growth of a little bit more than 11%. So that's very essential for the German and also for the European companies. And another point I would like to mention that we what can politics do for energy efficiency? We try to work on it and give it an idea that it is essential for the companies by for example a competitive tendering system, and for example DENEFF is working on this, and we are right now in Germany we're trying to start up with NAPI, what means a National Action Program on Energy Efficiency, and we nearly made it that we get competitive tendering systems as there are seen in, for example, Maine and also in Portugal. So I would say that's for the first 2 minutes should be enough, and I'm happy to discuss it with you.
Thank you very much. Also, politics is important. Tom, could you give your introduction?
Sure. Okay, I'm Tom DeLay, Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust. We've been around for about 15 years. We were originally funded by government and set up as a private company to bridge the gap between government and business on energy efficiency, climate change, and matters related. In the last 5 years, we've moved away from core government funding, and now we work primarily funded by businesses, governments around the world, and other institutional organizations. We do three things. We provide advisory services, we measure and certify the environmental impacts of organizations, products, and services, and we help develop and deploy low-carbon technologies. And I'm just going to focus really on the first of those three areas in my comments this morning. We're a small organization, about 180 people. Therefore, we can really only act as a catalyst by working with our partners and clients and customers around the world, and that's very much our model. I looked behind me at the board, and two words came up that just exemplify the challenge that we face, business and transformation. Our view is that business will do the heavy lifting of building a sustainable low-carbon future. Governments will help, will set the frameworks for markets, for standards, for regulation, but at the end of the day, if you can't make the business case, it's not going to happen. The resources, both financial, human, the capabilities of businesses to actually deploy what needs to happen at scale is unmatched and pretty much unique. The second challenge, though, is getting businesses to think in terms of transformation. Businesses don't like transformation. That implies breaking the investment cycle, getting them to do something that they wouldn't normally do, that the market hasn't necessarily prepared them for. Businesses love going with the flow of a market. It's how they make money. If you ask them to now invest in new markets at a different pace, that's very challenging to them. So that's the challenge, and how do you sort of put some scale onto it? It's a really difficult problem. I've spent some time looking at the deep decarbonisation scenarios developed globally as part of the run-up to COP in Paris. And there are a few things that come out of those scenarios. They're all individually put together by various countries and by academic institutions, typically around the world. But they all have an enormous slug of energy efficiency as being the first thing that you would do to deeply decarbonize your economy. And that makes sense. There's a strong business case for it. It makes sense. But we all know that energy efficiency is easier to talk about and promise than to actually deliver. So what I'd like to do now, just very briefly, is share with you some of our experience in the more recent years of actually trying to take energy efficiency deployment, the doing it bit, out beyond the UK into programs that we've developed and run in Mexico, South Africa, China, Malaysia, etc. Our starting point was a lot of experience from the UK. We worked for almost 10 years running probably the biggest business energy efficiency program. And for a policy cost of less than $10 a tonne of carbon, which is still pretty much the lowest cost program of its scale I've ever seen, we managed to engage an enormous raft of businesses, both small, medium and large, who supported this program and delivered at the end of the day massive financial savings to themselves, well over $5 billion a year, and then carbon savings verified of over 60 million tonnes of CO2. The verification bit is very important. I'm going to come back to that in the external context. So that was the background, and we sort of thought about this and said, well, what makes that relevant? Who will be interested in what we've done in the UK elsewhere? And the first thing we've realized is we learned a lot by making lots of mistakes. Boy, did we make mistakes. We got everything wrong. And then we corrected it, and we got things a bit better, and eventually we got things right, and then the market changed, so you had to change them again. So there really is, in our work around the world, a couple of lessons I'd just like to highlight. The first is, it's not a think exercise, it's a think, do, think. And you've got to come back and think again on an incredibly quick cycle. The notion of programs being run for years on the basis of an original template, cloud cuckoo land. Markets change far quicker than that, and the programs have got to be long-term and dynamic enough to actually respond to changes in markets. So, there are some underlying principles that always work. The barriers to energy efficiency, you've got to get commitment, you've got to have some practical solutions, and at the end of the day, you've got to have the resources, financial and human, to put them in place. You know that you can deliver 20% savings typically. You'll get IRRs of mid-teen returns on most capital investment in energy efficiency with a payback of 2 years or less. That's great. but have you actually deployed it deeply and at great scale across all the industry sectors that you're interested in? Very, very few examples around the world of that. And I think one of the challenges, as I go around now increasingly working with organizations trying to deploy energy efficiency at scale around the world, is the need for verification, because people come up with all kinds of drivers and at the end of the day see the success in, has this particular white certificate scheme or this scheme or that scheme actually worked? The verification's got to be honest and true. And for right or wrong, we employed the big four accounting firms to come and verify the work that we did from very early on in the program in the UK. And I think it's something that we inevitably say to anybody around the world, you've got to verify it. It's got to be honest, otherwise there's far too much scope for dodgy accounting. The second thing that I'd like to pick up very quickly as kind of an overall message, whilst there are many things that are common around the world, and it's all too easy to say, yeah, every country, every situation is different, it isn't. Energy efficiency, even the technologies and the methods and the solutions and the approaches, everything from building standards to variable speed drives on electric motors, yeah, these things are common. These are global issues, and therefore it's not surprising the solutions can be global, but the context in which the solution has to be deployed is invariably local. So, think global, act local. Every big corporate has always said that, and it's a mighty hard challenge to make real. In the context of energy efficiency, the one thing that we've picked up is that whilst in developed markets, it's a straightforward business case. You've just got to make the financial business case for investment in energy efficiency. You've got to aggregate the opportunities into something that somebody is willing to finance. You've got to find some way of making that happen. When you go around the developing world, actually there are local issues that become very, very real as well. So in our program in South Africa, it's absolutely clear that security of supply, in fact keeping the lights on at all, is an incredible challenge in the market in South Africa at the moment. So actually, energy efficiency is not just to save money, it's to keep the lights on and keep the energy and productivity going of the country as a whole. There are other aspects in South Africa. Regeneration. There's a big regeneration agenda, often linked to cities, and often that is a great opportunity to build the business case around regeneration. Go to China, and the link might be tenuous, and I spend quite a bit of time trying to understand it and then explain it. But there's no question that pollution has become such an issue in so many parts of China that actually part of the agenda for energy efficiency, and indeed, frankly, for anything in the clean tech space, is tied to pollution, because that really has caught everybody in China's attention very clearly. Yep, and then the last comment I was going to make was something I haven't heard of at all this morning, and it's often quite interesting because, of course, when there is no energy, is there a need for efficiency? Let's not forget that an enormous part of the agenda post-Paris is going to be around providing energy access to people who have no energy. And actually, designing energy efficiency in from scratch is, in many ways, far more straightforward, but you've got to want to do it. The number of examples we've found in low-income developing countries where actually energy access is seen as such a priority that the fact it's going to be coal-fired power is kind of put to one side because it's not really big enough. That can't be the right approach. We've got to get all of those local factors, pollution, regeneration, security of supply, energy access, right on top of the agenda. Otherwise, it won't happen. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Paul, could you give your introduction?
Thanks, Cornelis. So I think I'll talk at quite an international level. I think if we want to create systemic change, transformational change on climate change, on energy efficiency, on energy productivity, then collaboration in some form between some actors is absolutely critical. I think that collaboration, some of which we've heard of already on this panel, is it does many things. It's very efficient for the actors, so let's take the private sector, the corporations working together. It sends a strong signal to the market. If just one company or entity is doing something, that's one thing. If many collaborate together, it sends a very powerful message. And it also allows, particularly corporations, to take a risk together. Certainly our work, we see many corporations say, well, we want to do this, but we don't want to stick our head above the parapet because we don't want to get attacked for doing the wrong thing. So collaboration creates a safety net for those to lead, and I'll come more onto that in a minute. Certainly in our work at CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, we see that the private sector is collaborating more than ever on sustainability, on sustainable energy, on energy efficiency. In fact, when we started CDP in the year 2000, the idea was to have institutional investors collaborate on a standardized request for disclosure from corporations on climate change. We still do that today at CDP. It's what we're most known for. We run a global disclosure system where a group of investors, some 800 investors with $90 trillion assets under management, collaborate to make one simple, straightforward request to all of the corporations that they invest in. And I think that collaboration of investors has enabled us to create a new norm in business behavior on disclosure on climate change, and more recently expand that into water and forest. So the power of collaboration is immense. I think that, and disclosure is one thing. It's very efficient. We want a harmonized request. There should be a standardized approach. Business likes generally a standardized approach. We need innovation, but the markets have a healthy way of standardizing that innovation quite quickly themselves. So we've seen this year more than 5,000 corporations disclose on climate change. That's some 60% of global market capitalization is doing that. What does that information tell us? Well, more than 10,000 emission reduction initiatives have been reported from those 5,000 companies, and more than half of those, no surprise, are from energy efficiency, because in many ways energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit of reducing energy costs and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because it tends to have the dual win-win very early on in the system. So that's to be expected. I think Tom particularly mentioned the build-up to Paris, and what we've seen in the road to Paris now is a lot of new collaboration. I think there are so many initiatives, we certainly don't need any new ones, and probably we should focus on scaling the existing initiatives and some of them merging together, and there's some good work going on there. In the UNFCCC language, there's this new meme of what they talk about non-state actors. How many people in the audience know what I mean by non-state actors? Put your hand up, please. A few. That's good on this side of the room. It's very government language, but in really what we're talking about is the world's governments have realized they can't solve climate change on their own. They can't create the energy transformation on their own. As we've heard from other panelists, the private sector in particular is critical. But governments are talking about non-state actors as corporations, investors, cities and states and regions, and that we all have to act together if we're to have any chance of achieving anything close to keeping warming to 2 degrees and transforming the energy system between now and 2050, now and the end of the century, depending which country you're in. So we at CDP have been collaborating with a group of other non-profits who work with business on climate change under what's called the We Mean Business initiative. And We Mean Business is CDP, the Climate Group, World Business Council on Sustainable Energy, and others. And what we've been doing is saying, look, there's a number of actions we think the private sector needs to take to transform the global economy and keep us somewhere close to 2 degrees. And I'll just talk about a couple of those. Firstly, on science-based targets. So the science of what is required for 2 degrees has firmed up. We have carbon budgets. Everybody should understand what a carbon budget means. What does that mean for your own company? We see corporations now, the majority of them setting some target to reduce emissions or for energy efficiency. But are those targets really good enough? Are they in line with what the science requires? So we see now already more than 50 corporations have made public commitments to set science-based emissions reduction targets. And there will be a lot more announced such things before Paris.
Paul, can you be brief on listing these
Sure,
initiatives so that we can discuss
We'll come back to them. So there are a number of other initiatives committing to 100% renewable energy, committing to using a carbon price and advocating that governments bring in a carbon price. There's a new initiative very relative to the topic on this panel around energy efficiency or energy productivity. Can companies double energy productivity by 2030? So these are kind of leadership challenges. Not everyone's going to do them, but as some do them, again, we think we can create new norms in the market that are absolutely required if we have any chance of creating a sustainable economy and sustainable energy system by 2050. So I think what we see is that the private sector really has to collaborate on sustainability, on energy efficiency, so that we create this transformational change, and then they compete after that.
Thank you very much, Paul. What I would like to hear from the you mentioned a lot, you talked a lot about collaboration, Paul. I'd also like to hear from the other panel members, how important is collaboration? How important is, apart from the regular collaboration that you have in the supply chain, with clients, etc., but how important is cooperation with colleague companies or colleague organizations, with NGOs, with international organizations? How important is that for you? And I also want to connect that to the question that we got from the audience and that got most votes so far. And that question is, how can we collaborate and avoid death by initiatives in enhancing energy productivity? And if I understand it well, death by initiatives is there are so many initiatives, but do they really work? Do they really have an impact? So maybe you can answer the question. How important is collaboration, but also how can we do that effectively? Please, yeah, Guy?
Collaboration, from my point of view, is absolutely key. If I look at the partners that we've struck up in the UK, we have Unilever, AXA, Nobel, Heineken. These are all companies who are looking for something rather more than just an energy supply. They're looking for the new way ahead. It's also part of their credentials. It's also the way that they wish to market themselves to their consumers. It's absolutely important. I go back to something that I said earlier, which was the role of government and the initiative question. Government initiatives don't tend to really work because they're being laid down in some sort of complex construct. It's got to come from the bottom rather than from the top. So it's about companies changing their attitudes and then having like-minded energy companies who also see that way ahead. The problem at the moment, and we go back to the business case, is how do you make money out of that model? And that is a conundrum. But the faith is, if you collaborate, if you work together, and you have a joint purpose and a joint target, then actually everybody will make enough out of that to make it worthwhile.
Yes?
Well, I'd say collaboration is essential because, well, I was in London last time in March of last year. I've been with my friend to, how was the fair called?
EcoBuild.
Okay, we have been to EcoBuild. And that was very, very impressive. So take the German industry. I would say, especially the German industry is good on in technology. But you are, here in the UK, you are much more better in, well, in the financial issues, in selling those business opportunities to the public and make money out of it. And that was our impression, that especially, and that would be a chance for a real tight cooperation.
Okay. Tom?
Yeah, I agree. Collaboration is incredibly important and also incredibly valuable. We picked up some experience of collaboration in the R&D and the innovation space with the big offshore wind program that's now been running for over 5 years. And the first question, though, is are people really willing to collaborate? Most businesses like to compete. That's how they make money. They compete. They beat the other guy up. So finding the area where they're willing to collaborate, it might be you collaborate first and then you compete, or just finding a way of saying, look, that area of this work we can collaborate on, but that bit we're going to compete on. So in offshore wind development, we took a view that everything below the turbine, which is about 2/3 of the value of offshore wind, people are willing to collaborate on because the developers who actually make that happen don't want to own the technology and the IP. They just want to have a relatively low-cost proven solution they can invest in. So we created an R&D club, and it was a collaboration club. And at the end of the day, it's meant, because we've got 2 governments on board with minority stakes of funding, that actually for every one of the 9 industry partners, they get a $14 return on every dollar they put into the R&D program. So that's collaboration, but it's by recognizing that there are some people in that space who simply want to compete. So I think that's really important. On the question of initiatives, yeah, this is a crowded space. It's an early stage crowded space, like most markets. Very few barriers to entry, an awful lot of people pile in. At the end of the day, it's got to shake out. And at the end of the day, the things that are really valued by the market will emerge as being stronger. So when people understand what their USP is, what their added value is, if it's real, then that'll work its way through. But it does take an awful lot of time. And at the moment, there does seem to be an enormous range of initiatives in almost every field. often being supported by individual and different factors and governments and funders around the world. So to some degree, don't blame the market and the people in the market. Also look at some of the governments who really are not collaborating as effectively because they all want to have, you know, their photo call for their success story.
Paul, maybe also focus on the death by initiatives. That would be an interesting point for you. I must say, you mentioned We Mean Business, and when I first encountered We Mean Business, I thought, hey, that's again another initiative. And only later I learned that this is a corporation. But please, go ahead.
No, it's a great question. I think Tom said it very well, that we have a bit of an explosion of initiatives because we have basically one of the world's greatest challenges that we've ever been aware of, and everyone, you know, increasingly wants to do something about it. That's positive. That energy is positive. It's very disparate at the moment, and innovation is often very disparate. And I think Tom's exactly right. The initiatives and actions that deliver most value to corporations, governments, the stakeholders involved with them, they will be the ones that scale and grow and survive ultimately. I think there is a risk of death by initiatives. You know, we have created many initiatives at CDP, as have many others. We work with companies, investors in particular, and they say, look, we don't want any more initiatives, we want to bring these together. So I think we need to see more harmonisation of initiatives and some really good work going on. Some public, a lot behind the scenes on that, because that can bring greater standardisation. As I said before, I started my career in mergers and acquisitions in the private sector. Try doing mergers and acquisitions in the non-profit world. It's nearly impossible. But it is possible. We merged a forest disclosure project into CDP because we had climate and water, and shouldn't they be together? And there are a few bubbling, exciting ones that I'm not allowed to talk about, but behind the scenes that I think you will see happen in the next couple of years. It is really, as Tom said, all about this value. To our supply chain program at CDP, we have 75 multinational corporations collaborating. Why are they collaborating to engage their suppliers? Because they do compete as well. It's, well, if you take in China, if an individual multinational asked a Chinese supplier for environmental information, at best they'll get about 30% of their suppliers provide some information. The quality is pretty poor. If you can get 3 multinationals to ask the same Chinese supplier, so they're all buying from them, you can get 100% compliance from that Chinese supplier, because the Chinese supplier will say, look, this is X% of our business, we'll just do this as part of doing business. So again, it becomes a norm in the market. But I do think those involved, as Tom said, the different actors need to collaborate themselves. Governments and businesses are also very involved in many different initiatives, and bringing them together is key. And ultimately prioritising. You know, if you're running a business, you're an investor, you need to know what are your priorities and which initiatives deliver real value to you, and the ones that don't, you have to say no to.
Okay. Guy?
Death by initiative is probably an interesting phrase for me right now. The Labour government launched the offshore initiative in the UK. It was supposed to bring 70,000 jobs, 15 gigawatts of power. Actually, they were quoting 20 gigawatts at the time. It was enormously exciting to a number of foreign investors who all saw this as a new dawn, as a way to invest and actually take that particular market forward. Because we suffer by cycle in this country of changing governments, where are we now? It is a complete reversal away from that principle, where foreign investors have put in tens of millions, and in some cases hundreds of millions of pounds into that program. And at a government whim, it will not happen. Now that is death by initiative, because those companies will not be back. So initiatives need to be thought through, and they need to be consistent.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and thanks for I don't know who that is, but who phrased this term, death by initiatives. Okay, good. Thank you. There is one burning question that already got 6 votes so far, and that's on the top, and that also nicely connects the previous session with this one. And that question is, how are bottom-up and participatory approach actions, say the decentralized local actions, taken on board into this large-scale, global, international, collaborative initiatives? Who wants to say something about that connection between these low-level local action of individual citizens and citizen groupings to the big story of international climate change and energy productivity?
From my perspective, consumers will change the world, but it's going to take a number of years, if not decades, to get to that position. Consumers will vote with their feet and their wallets, and I think it's that will change business attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. At the end of the day, nobody ever designed the internet. They facilitated it, and it happened. And I think to some degree we've got to look the same way if we really want things to happen at a massive scale. The only danger is that do things local, do things that are decentralized, small scale, is emotionally very appealing. But sometimes that simply isn't the economically rational way of doing something. So I think actually getting some reality in this to recognize that some things are best done locally and can be built on local action, aggregated then together to get some economies of scale, that makes great sense. But sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. So we have too many things being promoted in too many different ways where, frankly, the chances of success are very, very slim.
I think clearly, citizens as consumers when we buy things and voters when we vote in electoral polls are very, very important. I tend to think that you won't get the whole of the citizenry to kind of start to think something's important often early enough. So you have a great interrelation between top down and bottom up. But I think if you look at things like Avaz, this kind of online campaigning, is it powerful or not? But it's certainly reaching a scale. And when things reach scale, people pay attention. When there were 400,000 people on the streets of New York last September campaigning about climate change, everybody wanted to be involved suddenly. You look with the migrant crisis here, as the media likes to call it, when the Sun changed its position and the UK government changed their position, why did they do that? Because they realised that actually the public thought this is outrageous, right? And suddenly they changed. So public opinion, and when there's enough of a scale of a consensus, there's never really consensus amongst the public, I think, but it feels like that. Media has an important role. Media says, this is what the public want, they're not representing everyone, then you can see really great change, I think.
That brings me to the follow-up burning question, and maybe you can, if your intervention, also take that into account. How can consumers be influenced to demand more green and sustainable options? That's the question that got 6 votes, but also in connection to that, are they already moving or do they need to be moved?
Well, just let me give a very simple idea. You can move the consumers by saving money, but we, especially in the field of energy efficiency, I would say we should try to make the consumer having fun saving energy or being energy efficient. So just if we switch over to transport issues, nearly everybody wants to get more miles out of a gallon, but because everybody knows how much gas his own car is burning. To be honest, who knows how much oil your house is burning? Nearly nobody knows it. So the first step is we have to show the people how much they are using and how much they are paying for their energy, and then there should be a chance to make them having fun being energy efficient or behave in an energy efficient way.
Entirely agree. Our central strategy of Eneco is the smart meter, and if they're called smart meters, they're not. They're an interface to control your energy. It's not about being the smart meter that all the consumer groups have an issue with. So people are taking those up. They're beginning to buy them. And we are seeing some innovative products come on the market and some innovative companies. You look at the Cooperative Energy Group, for instance, who have their customers have a user-chooser tariff, and they can choose where their electricity comes from. Enormously successful and popular. Other companies doing similar things. So consumers are beginning to vote. They're beginning to take these things up, and it is challenging the traditional model. Yeah.
Okay, are there questions from the audience? Please go ahead. Is there a microphone? Please state your name.
My name is Roelof Westerbeek. I work for DSM. I'm the global head of the engineering plastics business. Now, before you're going to chase me out of the room because plastics are very polluting and not very sustainable, sustainability is the biggest business driver that we have in our business. 50% of our sales is sustainable, driven by sustainability. And actually, we make much higher percentage points of margin on that sustainable business. So we talked about business cases. If there is a business case, I think it's good stuff. But anyway, my question is to Guy, is from your perspective, I recently listened to a speech of Jeremy Rifkin, the economist, who predicted that utility companies such as yourself will go through a big transition in the way that consumers will be producers, and that you will be only managing the flow and inflow and outflow of electricity by the Internet of Things. He is also, by the way, a big advisor to the German government. He claims that what Germany is doing very well is his idea and not Frau Merkel's idea. But anyway, so I would like to have your perspective on how you see, because you talked about the different role of the consumer, but what is the next step? What is the perspective of your company on what will happen 20, 30 years from now in that respect? Thank you.
And it's a very relevant question, of course, because it's an uncomfortable truth for utility companies, which have ruled the roost for the last 50, 60 years with their vertically integrated model. In this country, there's been an inquiry as to how all those costs are allocated. My chief executive, Jeroen de Haas, absolutely believes that the margins in electricity supply are going to diminish to being marginal, if not zero. It's about what you do for your consumer. It's about how you give them products and services that help them take control and not be frightened of that paradigm. A consumer having control, is that really such a bad thing? As I say, consumers have had to receive what you're prepared to give them in the past. Well, those days are over. Companies that don't react quickly enough in the utility sector will not be there, and that is the firm belief. We are seeing other sorts of companies come through. We're seeing the Apples and Googles of this world begin to step into non-traditional market areas. Is it a revolution that's going to happen overnight? I don't think so, but is it something that's going to happen within the next 5 to 10 years? Then yes. And you have to make decisions based on that, and our company has already made that decision.
Okay. Another question from the audience? Yes? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Heather Allen from the SLOCAT Partnership, the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Partnership, quite a mouthful. So my focus is very much obviously on transport. I'd be very interested to hear how the panel feels. I mean, we've heard the suggestion there's been too many initiatives. There are a lot of initiatives. There's going to be a lot of action from the private sector, particularly in climate change and obviously on energy productivity. But I would be very interested to hear your views on two things. One, where do you see the most disruptive actions coming from? Which side of the planet? Where might this come from? Because I think this is going to drive real change. And secondly, what do you see the impact of the present oil price being on energy productivity? Because nobody saw that. We have political leaders in 2015 that are trying to look into the future glass of 2050. But if you look at the leaders of 1915 trying to look into the glass of what it would look like in 1950, just how wrong could they have been? Just how wrong might we be?
Okay, two questions. Who of you want to tackle the question on what disruptive action will have most impact? Or yes, please?
I'll have a go. I mean, at the end of the day, it comes back to my opening comment. Transformation is tough for existing industries. You've got to assume that disruptive action will take place mainly from new players who will come into markets where the barriers to entry are reasonably low. Certainly, in our activity supporting low-carbon technologies, the really disruptive changes are coming in on everything that is software, electronics, power electronics based, where you can do an enormous scale out and you can really develop something very exciting with a real impact at a relatively low capital base. It's far more difficult to do the same thing with the same impact on something that involves, you know, huge tons of steel and concrete. So I think it'll come from people we haven't seen coming along yet, I think, for disruption. I would just comment very quickly on oil and gas, if I may. My own background, I was for many years with Shell. Something that's very clear is that the world's economies, and indeed the oil and gas companies, are very good at actually managing quite severe disruptions in oil and gas price. They've learned that over the years. They've learned how to hedge their positions, and they're broadly competent at that. They don't necessarily relate that to carbon pricing. So very roughly, depending on what you would use the oil for, you know, $100 a ton of carbon is equivalent to about $40 a barrel of oil. Now, $40 a barrel of oil is comfortably within the range of volatility that companies are used to working with over the last decade or so. And yet, everybody freaks out at the idea of $100 a ton of carbon. You know, we shouldn't be talking of carbon price in terms of anything less than $25 a ton. It's just not relevant.
Again, from experience in the oil industry, I mean, the oil price is a highly political price. And what are we seeing at the moment? We're seeing a reduction in that price. Why? Because of overproduction. You could take the theory it's to kill off the fracking industry in the States, which has got to have 50 to 60 as its price. Forever, everybody's chased cheap energy, oil and gas, oil at a price of that. I mean, I remember when it was $18 a barrel and we still drilled for it. But it is, we are going to take a long time to get ourselves off the oil fix. And unfortunately, this country is trying to say that fracking is going to provide cheap gas. It will not.
Okay, thank you. We need to get we need to get to a close of the panel. So I want to say there are a lot of questions. There is one question on whether how we stop the debate whether climate change is anthropogenic or not. But I think that would need a completely different panel. So let's postpone that one. What I'd like to ask to the panel as a closing question is. In the beginning, we talked about politics, and both from the negative and the positive angle. Say it can, politics can help, but can also be disruptive. What do we need? What does collaborative action on energy efficiency, on increasing energy productivity, need most from politics now? I would like to have that as a final question to all of you.
Quick sentence.
Okay, good.
Right. Consistency and a long-term view.
I completely agree, and I would say collaboration is also essential because of one issue we haven't discussed here. We were just talking about the oil prices. Well, I'm pretty. I really don't know how oil prices will change or will move if we have, let's say, if there comes back the crisis into Ukraine, if there will happen anything in the Russian Federation. So, and these issues can also be only be solved by collaboration.
Honesty and a willingness to learn from mistakes.
So learning from mistakes, yeah.
I think in the political spectrum, we still need a lot more leadership. We have some of it from Germany, and Europe's been leading a lot on climate change for a long while. I think if you look at history, there's Obama is doing disruptive action in the United States on climate policy. Not that radical, but it's pretty disruptive because you can't get anything through Congress, and he's doing it outside. Equally in China, the Chinese government, for many reasons, is implementing a carbon price, and by 2017, China will have the largest carbon trading scheme in the world. And we all know how important China is in international trade. So California sets a carbon price with a rising floor price. You could call it a tax. So there's lots of creeping disruptive action And I think it's where then collaboration is happening between governments, and there are a lot of bilateral agreements, that some of them which will be much more ambitious and perhaps more powerful than an international agreement that might be a bit lower in ambition. So I think that watching that disruptive action and then where people collaborate to amplify it, it will be really exciting.
Okay, thank you very much for all these contributions. Difficult, say it was a very broad and rich discussion. Difficult to summarize. I want to summarize with 3 messages, and for me it's completely clear that not everything that was discussed here is tackled. 3 things. Collaboration is important to everyone, but it's also clear that it's an area that is rapidly moving, where there are developments in mergers and acquisition, as it's what called, say it is something that is developing, and also talking about learning, also where we need to learn. Second is how important the consumer is, was stressed again. Say consumer being my important driver for change, also the mutual influencing of global action and global collaborative action and local consumer action is an important element that needs to be taken into account, and they can mutually positively influence each other. And finally, the importance of politics also here. And then we didn't talk about detailed regulation or so, but about leadership, consistency and a long-term view. So that's my brief summary. I want to thank all of you for your contribution, and let's move on to the next session. Thank you.